Bienvenidos a todos a este seminario web coordinado por ARPEL y la empresa Sproule. En el chat que encontrarán abajo de la interfaz de Zoom puse información sobre la interpretación simultánea. Contamos con interpretación simultánea en este webinar porque sabemos que nuestra asistencia principalmente habla español, es de habla hispana, y Floris, quien es nuestro disertante hoy, va a hacer su presentación en inglés. Entonces, si se sienten más cómodos escuchando en español, pueden ir al icono interpretación abajo de la interfaz de Zoom y acceder al canal de español. Y lo voy a decir en inglés. So for our English-speaking attendees, Floris will do his presentation in English, but I will speak Spanish, and some questions at the end of this webinar might be in Spanish. So if you want to hear everything in English, you can go to the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom interface. It's like a globe, and choose the English channel. Okay, so that was to start with some logistics, important logistics for everyone to understand what we'll be saying Floris during this webinar. Entonces, sigo en español. Este webinar es la continuación del webinar que tuvimos hace 15 días, también organizado con Sproule, que trataba de CCUS, captura, almacenamiento, uso de carbono. Y hoy vamos a hablar de otro tema que tiene mucho potencial en América Latina, que es geotermia. Yo soy Tiffen Lemoiner, trabajo en la Asociación de Empresas de Petróleo, Gas y Energía Renovable de América Latina y el Caribe, ARPEL. Como este webinar está abierto a socios y no socios, quiero aclarar brevemente que ARPEL nuclea empresas operadoras y proveedoras de petróleo, gas y energía renovable de Latinoamérica y el Caribe, y estas empresas operan en más de 30 países. Bueno, si bien ARPEL como asociación viene trabajando obviamente todos los impactos ambientales de la industria desde hace muchísimo tiempo, hay un grupo de trabajo de cambio climático que también existe desde hace años. Este año se lanzó un comité de transiciones energéticas y con un evento, una conferencia que se organizó a fines de abril acá en Montevideo en conjunto con nuestro socio ANCAP. Entonces hay una movida muy fuerte desde la asociación para trabajar todo lo que es transiciones energéticas, iniciativas de descarbonización. Entonces esta serie de 2 webinars que estamos coorganizando con la empresa Sproule está en esta línea. Entonces, para bajar a tierra y volver a nuestro encuentro de hoy, la producción de energía geotérmica es una oportunidad de crecimiento potencial en América, en el Caribe. Varios sitios ya están en operación y más de una docena de proyectos ya han sido anunciados. Es una energía eficiente, proporciona generación de energía renovable de base las 24 horas del día, los 7 días de la semana, que sabemos que puede ser una contra de algunas de las energías renovables más que conocemos más capaz, y reduce la emisión de gases de efecto invernadero. perdón. Entonces, esta fuente de energía ofrece oportunidades para la generación de calor y energía competitivas, al tiempo que reduce el costo total de la electricidad. El mercado geotérmico es en gran parte inexplorado en América Latina y enfrenta desafíos porque necesita altas inversiones iniciales, pero también en la región contamos con experiencia en la industria del oil and gas que puede ser útil para, bueno, desde la perforación de los pozos hasta las operaciones. Entonces, nuestro disertante hoy es Floris Weger, espero pronunciar más o menos bien. Es neerlandés, basado en Países Bajos, si no me equivoco. Es el director gerente de geotermia en Sproule y fundó la división de geotermia de Sproule, VGEO, en 2012 y ha dedicado su carrera al desarrollo geotérmico. Entonces, en este webinar, Floris va a compartir su experiencia en la realización y gestión de operaciones geotérmicas. Lo único que quiero agregar es que mientras Floris haga su presentación, pueden usar el icono de Q&A, que también está abajo de la interfaz de Zoom, creo que no lo dije todavía, y pueden hacer sus preguntas en inglés o en español. Y yo al final de la presentación de Floris, le comunicaré las preguntas, ¿no? Estaré moderando la sesión de Q&A. Lo otro que quiero decir es que luego de esta actividad estaremos mandando la presentación de Floris y también estará disponible en el canal de YouTube de ARPEL la grabación de este webinar. Ya está disponible en el canal YouTube de ARPEL la grabación del webinar anterior. Voy a poner en el chat para acceso de todos los participantes el enlace a este canal. Creo que ya hablé lo suficiente, así que Floris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction and the opportunity to give this presentation today. My name is Floris Vieger, and I will give a short introduction about myself before we go into the topic. My background is petroleum engineering, and I started my career in geothermal energy, especially as a production engineer with all kinds of problems in the developing emerging industry in the Netherlands, where we use a lot of geothermal for heat production, especially in the greenhouses I will talk a bit about today. So it started with projects, drilling operations, well testing, and many geochemical production related challenges. In that period, I basically worked with a couple of the first operating companies in the Netherlands, growing from a couple of business developers into real operations and operators with larger teams. In that period, we had more and more of these great plants developed, like you see here, with 2 wells, production and injection, and providing the heat over the energy system to the clients. In the last 10 years, I developed a team to execute that project development, do that workovers, production engineering support, etc., and moved more and more into the drilling operations and consultancy. So on the right hand, you see a kind of drilling operation in the middle of those greenhouses where we drill 2 wells to develop that geothermal heat. The team developed into a larger team with a lot of production engineers, but also geoscientists and business developers and commercial people. And at some point, it was very stable, and we had a strong position in the Netherlands with the team. So VGO became Sproule. Sproule is an international company, advisory and a geoscience company based in Calgary, Canada. And together with Sproule, we are able to bring the expertise we developed here in the Netherlands to other places in the world. And that's what we're currently doing. And we are growing the business and working already in some of the places in North and South America. Part of the introduction, what is geothermal energy? I think most of the people here will know a little bit more already. But to be very general, in the first place, I would divide the industries in more or less three areas. The first is the shallow ATS, geothermal energy. Those are the systems within the first 200 meters depth of the Earth, where you can store heat in summer and bring the heat up in winter, and do the opposite for cold. So it can also be used for cooling. It's a very local solution, often linked to one building only, and it can be very attractive for many heat and cold users. We are not too much active in that area because it's very local oriented. You need just the specific shallow aquifer, and you can use a local contractor to execute that work. What we are more used to work on is on the number 2 and 3, the mid and the high enthalpy. Mid enthalpy is often, especially in Europe, for heat production in the range of 1,500 to 3,000 meters depth. Impermeable reservoirs, aquifers, which can allow water to flow through. It can generate heat production between the 15 and 25 megawatt of heat production, where you can cool the water down to 30 degrees and use that heat in your heat network. Coefficient of performance are much higher because it's really production of heat. So normally you use pumps to circulate the water, and that's normally in a range of 1 part of electricity in to 25 to 45 amounts of energy out. Can be in the form of heat, but in many areas you can also use it directly for electricity. That break-off is often around 110, 120 degrees Celsius when that becomes more interesting, and the technology behind it is in development. So I think over the next few years we'll see that with some lower temperatures, electricity making is also profitable and interesting. A couple of examples on mid-enthalpy are the Paris, Munich, and Dutch heat networks, which basically connect the built environment and greenhouses to the heat supply. Denmark is also developing a lot of those projects, and in Poland it's also used for quite some time now. Then there is the high enthalpy geothermal, which I think most of the Latin American market is way more familiar with. It's the larger projects, over 100 megawatt electricity generating. It's in volcanic active regions where you have very high temperatures. It can be around 150, but there are also examples of 250 degrees plus. And it's very well known in Italy, in New Zealand, Iceland, Indonesia, Central America, where we will have a look into, but also in the Philippines, for example. I see these three groups as real industries. It's profitable business in some areas, but you also have a lot of other developments which might become profitable or proven over the next decade. One development which is already ongoing for some time is the enhanced geothermal systems, drilling in whatever rock and frack the rock, open the rock, and create a flow through that open system. It's called enhanced geothermal systems of hot dry rock. Recent developments are taking place in Utah, the Forge project, and I must say that most of those projects are more linked to academic studies, and not so many are really commercial projects. Then there are some conductive system developments taking place. So it's closed loop or deep boil heat exchangers. Those systems basically don't use the fluids which are inside the rock, but they just use heat flow by conduction. These are often less effective in terms of the amount of energy you can gain from one well, with those closed loop developments, with a lot of well length, long well trajectories, higher amounts of energy could come out there as well. But this is really in development, and some pilot projects are currently taking place. There are some mine water projects where heat is produced from the mine shafts and the open area and the subsurface for a stable temperature. You could see them as shallow geothermal because they use heat pumps most often as well. But mine water projects can also create quite large volumes of energy. So I think it's you can look at them separately. Then there are quite some interesting synergies under development, partly in the R&D space, but also ready to commercialize, especially the combination of geothermal with lithium extraction. If there are high volumes of lithium in an aquifer, you can mine those through the brine, extract them, and use either lithium or geothermal as a byproduct, whatever you're more focused on and what you use in certain areas. CO2 sequestration, CCUS, is an industry currently very much in development, and there are also some thoughts of combining that with geothermal energy. But I see them all as other developments, as it is not a real industry around it yet. Just to give you a bit overview on the different technologies which are currently in place, and then we zoom in a little bit more on Latin America and the Caribbean. I think it's great what has been developed in Central America already. It's the high enthalpy conventional geothermal systems, and it's already providing 8% of the electricity need in that area. It's a significant number. It's a significant industry with a lot of successful stories and some with some challenges. But it is clear that this area is very suitable for it. So, if you look at various reports in the region, there is way more potential to develop more of those projects. Currently, there is around 1.7 gigawatt development, and the feasibility studies show that number could go up to 5.5 to 7, which is very, very significant. So I would say let's see how we can develop that all together. If you look at the future, I think many of those projects can still be developed in that area. But I also think it's interesting to see to look at places which are not necessarily on that hotspot in the middle of a volcanic area. There are positive economics for developing geothermal projects in sedimentary basins, also with lower geothermal gradients, which could be used for direct use heating, and also for electricity generation if you are above that 110, 120 degrees Celsius. The good thing on the data and the development of those projects is that the data intensity is often in sedimentary basins because of the oil and gas infrastructure there and developments. So that's something which I think will kick off over the next years as well. We will go into that a bit more deeper in the next slides. There are some other relevant technologies which will support developments also in Latin America, which could be implemented and successful. And I think we just discussed them. Apart from the ORC efficiencies, if an organic Rankine cycle becomes more effective, or if you have Kalina cycles or other electricity making systems at lower temperatures, if those developments go rapidly, then definitely it opens up an entire new area for development. Just to give you a bit of a view on the entire industry development, I've seen some of the developments here in Europe, and if you look at the longer history of high enthalpy developments, it all starts with great ideas. People who are creative combine some dots and think, why are we not doing this? Then you have some pilot projects, small scale projects, and if it all works out, you might get an industry. I think there's one very important thing to realize there, and that's that you need some strong basis, which is infrastructure, government support, financial institutions understanding it and willing to pay for it. So I just go shortly through this slide, and then I will give you some examples of some of the things I can show you today. Often great ideas are not great ideas from people themselves. It's because they heard it from someone else who did it in a great way. For example, this high enthalpy stuff was developed in Italy. US companies developed it as well in the Geysers project in California, and the technologies around it were simply adapted to other places in the world as well. This is great, and I would say it's never bad to use some ideas of other people and develop that. That's great, and it's good that that's a kind of incentive to bring renewable energy in place. Sometimes you have really incidental opportunities. If for example there is a hot spring or an oil and gas E&P industry well, which is not producing oil but produces steam, then obviously those are kind of unique opportunities which could initiate a certain development. But if you look at some other places in the world, it can also be really demand-based. If you only have a good geology, you simply don't have a business case yet. You need demand. You can either need demand from electricity in a wider region, or you can have a very local demand on heat, which might fit the geology as well. So demand-based can be because of industries, greenhouses, the built environment, office heating and cooling. It can also be net zero goals. If a country decides we want to be 100% independent of oil and gas, it could be an incentive to develop multiple renewable energy sources and then see which ones fit the country or not. Energy security is an important one and becoming more and more important every day. And export of energy can also be a reason. If you have a very good geological situation for geothermal, but not the requirements itself for your country, then an export of that energy can be very interesting. Even some people think about using larger geothermal developments for hydrogen making and then exporting the hydrogen. Sometimes great ideas just start from motivated people, often geologists who think this particular geological situation or mountain range or aquifer is so great that we have to develop it. And those people are often very great initiators, but maybe not the best business people who can connect the dots with the demand. And sometimes it's diversification objectives of companies, for example, oil and gas companies who want to diversify their amount of their business into the renewable space and have some of those ingredients and knowledge in place to do that. So that's a kind of list of the great ideas, incentives, which could lead to pilot projects. Pilot projects are important. In pilot projects, you can play with it. You can make mistakes. You can learn. But it also costs money. As the moment you think about drilling a well to 2 kilometers depth, you will start at prices between 3 and 5 million US dollar. So in order to really make a project, you need multiple wells, you need facilities, you need a team, you need contractors, freelancers. So you need a lot of development there to just play around with it. You need that innovation before you can really go into feasible projects, small scale, which are also commercially viable. If you have those small scale projects, you don't have an industry yet. Normally, what we also see in some areas is that when an innovation in a pilot project works out, then people jump on it and make big organizations, and then still the organization doesn't have the demand yet, and they just make too many large developments without too many successes because they don't focus good enough. So some projects are really great and do a great job financially, but they are not really scalable. But then still you have a good small scale project in place. And the know-how is then often not centralized in a larger organization within multiple consultancy firms. This development we've seen a lot in Europe over the last decade, how smaller projects were simply connected by the external people, the consultants. If you really want to go into upscaling, obviously the small scale projects need to be successful. You need larger organizations behind it. You need to hire those people, train those people, make standardization of your commercial organization, legal, technologies, everything. Yeah, and then you can roll stuff out. Everyone knows the first thing you do a complicated thing in business, it takes a lot of time and you have to think it over and over. But at some point, you want to keep it simple, make it standard, and just roll it out over the area. And then you are upscaling it and making it more profitable for sure. And then you can get an industry. And I think a lot of geothermal projects in the world are still struggling in that small scale project development and find it difficult to really go into that industry. And I think we are in an interesting situation at the moment where this is taking place. On the infrastructure, in the beginning, you just lean on the drinking water industry or the oil and gas industry, on the technologies available from those areas, on the data which comes out of those industries in terms of geology knowledge. It might develop, and then you slowly build a network around the geothermal business itself. And at the end, you might have a full operational standard and classification of resources, and which are all bankable, known by the government, known by the financial institutions, etc. On the governmental support, in the beginning, they just tolerate you playing around with some new technologies, but at the end, they have to put good law in place. They need to have good unitization rules and also a good subsidy scheme, if applicable to certain areas. On the financial part, everyone knows that getting into finance on a creative idea is always hard. You need people who really believe in it, and at the end, when you've really proven your technologies, you can even go to larger investment funds. So you might even consider going public with an IPO. And I think on all those parts of this development for an industry, it's important to realize where you are with a project, how you want to build your organization, and how you want to roll out your geothermal development. I will just go a little bit in detail on some of the items shown here. I would like to give you some idea on how the E&P oil and gas industry fits this industry, the geothermal industry. I will also show an example on the demand-based side of development here in the Netherlands, where I'm from, and what I've seen over the last 10 years. Some of the technology and safety learnings and some innovation, and I will finish with some of the governmental support we've seen in Europe, which worked really well for the rollout of geothermal. So one of the projects we support here in the Netherlands, you can see here, it's in the middle of the greenhouse area where a lot of vegetables and flowers are grown. In 2008, a couple of greenhouse owners simply were linked to some well engineers, and they had the great idea, why don't we just drill a well? And because we want to be independent of oil and gas. The Groningen gas field, one of the larger gas fields in the area, is slowly closing down in the Netherlands, so that the prices of gas are going up, and there is especially now a lot of uncertainty regarding the gas prices with the war with Russia. So that's those are all drivers that especially greenhouse owners, but also the banks behind the greenhouse owners want to get an independent energy security for heating up those greenhouses. They use a lot of heat. I think for an average tomato you grow there, about 40% of the price is from the heat itself. So there are some ideas. The drivers were energy security and independency, but also the net zero goals and competitiveness played a big role, which the government saw as well, and the government supported with some great incentives. At the moment, I think we are producing over 6 terajoule per year of heat, which is a lot. It replaced almost 200 cube of natural gas, and it was a CO2 reduction of 365,000 tons. And at the moment, there are about 18 operating systems, and we basically support a large group of it with various services. And I think we can, maybe it's not a very mature industry yet, but at least there are many, many great commercial viable projects in place. So this was really driven by demand. The demand is the trigger, and the geology, the well engineering, all the technologies behind it just followed. It really started with the people who wanted to have that heat in place. There are other demand-driven direct use potential, I think, which are especially relevant in some areas in the world. There is a lot of food processing which needs energy, often steam, for many, many reasons. And it is a bit overlooked, because when you talk about energy, everybody normally starts to talk about electricity, but in many parts of the world, about half of the energy consumption is in the form of heat. Can be steam, can be hot water of 90 degrees. So it is a really big part of the energy consumption. So it can be used for processing, food processing, for all kind of other industries, from paper mills to wood drying, fish farms, oil production is another interesting topic where we will, which I will show later on. Oil production can use the heat to keep the oil flowing in an enhanced oil recovery project. I really like this example of the beers. It's a brewery making beers of a brew, which brews the beers using geothermal heat. And I think I never want any other beer anymore after seeing this. Unfortunately, I couldn't find those in the shops here. But that's all industry, the demand driven. So I think if you are a geothermal developer, if you think about the geological part only, you really make a mistake. You have to make that match between supply and demand. If you don't have the demand, you don't have your business case in place. Another big demand is the built environment, especially in countries where it's slightly colder. So you see here an example of a really large heat network in the area of the Netherlands, where we are developing with many companies heat networks which connect excess heat from the harbor of Rotterdam together with geothermal heat supply towards the greenhouses, but also a couple of cities, and it's all connected. And this is clearly a kind of rollout for the next decades to provide heat in a sustainable way. So this is all driven by demand, and that's, I think, again, important for a lot of geothermal developers, that this match is important. Another interesting opportunity drive could be a real opportunity for oil and gas companies which have wells in place, which have the subsurface data in place. We did quite some work on evaluating the options for those kind of companies. In the beginning, oil and gas companies looked at geothermal like it's a completely different industry. They didn't want to get involved too much, but after some time, they also saw the benefits and the opportunities. And it started with some studies on well reutilization. I think this is also a topic which is known by more people. You can look at various ways of using the wells. So if you look in this chart, it's normally in hydrocarbon well development starts with exploration. So drilling a well without knowing if you find oil or gas. If in that period you already think about the fallback scenario, if there's no oil and gas, that you can develop it in a kind of geothermal project, then you can already decrease the investment for that particular risk you take on the exploration. It might be fully commercial for geothermal or just a little bit. In either way, you want to drill that well for your oil and gas exploration. So why not having that fallback to either bring social acceptance and local contributions, or just to decrease your commercial risk. Another area where geothermal production can take place is within the production. Then we call that co-production, and you produce geothermal heat or electricity and oil or gas in one project simultaneously. There are quite some examples where this is the case, especially with oil wells, which have a lot of co-production of water. And of course, at the end of a lifetime, when a well is not producing oil and gas anymore, but it's still in place, you can think about several options to use that well for heat or electricity production. We looked at open hole systems. You can make it deep hole heat exchangers or closed loops. And you can also just use it for data extraction to enable geothermal development elsewhere in the area. There are many drivers for the E&P companies to do this. It can be decarbonation, it can be fully commercial, it can be the license to operate, or it could even add energy to your oil production system. There are also some other synergies between oil and gas companies and geothermal companies, which are currently taking place. And one of them is sometimes overlooked. It's simply keeping the service industry for wells in the air. Sometimes oil and gas has those big the upturns and the downturns. And if it's a downturn, then it's at least good that the geothermal stable industry keeps the people working and keeps the expertise in place in some areas. We did one study in particular in the past in the Netherlands. We looked at more than 2,500 wells, and we matched the locations where the geology was able to supply high temperature large volumes, and where the heat demand was large. And we looked at the combination of the two, and we did find one project which was end of production lifetime. It was a good aquifer drive where the water was in place, and it showed that you could easily get 8 megawatt in place from the heat production out of those wells. But there were still legal constraints at that time, and the distance to the heat demand was quite long. But technically, it was possible. If you look at it from a commercial part, it was also possible. Unfortunately, this was still not the best location in place. But there are many, many more places like this which can be evaluated and can show a very good profitability. Also, it would add additional gas production for that operator in the gas field. There are more opportunities like that. We learned more about one of the projects in Colombia where Parex and Ecopetrol are currently doing co-production, where they will extract heat from the oil and gas production. There are often wells drilled which were found where they didn't find oil and gas, and they became geothermal wells. So Greux-Schönebeck is a nice example where they did a lot of studies and academic work. And in Poland, there was a well which gave steam and no oil. And that was the initiation of an entire development in Zakopane. And it's a great show of how that worked. Another example I wanted to show you is some of the innovations which can really enable an industry. Innovation can happen, as I just mentioned, in oil and gas synergy systems, but can also be on materials. If you part of geothermal is also in the feasibility stage, where nobody really knows what the geochemistries are, what the impacts are. It's not simply a copy paste of oil and gas. Of course, you can use the oil and gas knowledge, but a lot of learnings are necessary to really enable that upscaling. And one of the developments we've been involved in is to apply a glass fiber reinforced epoxy pipe. think more than 8 wells have been installed now with this kind of pipe to fully eliminate the risk of corrosion and to also minimize the risk of scaling. It's important in the development from pilots into an industry to have those standards, safety standards, but also operating standards, either standardization, material selection, data acquisition plan. How do you test a well which the banker accepts to invest in, which the government accepts to produce from in your production permits? And that's an old development, which is it's a general industry development. And on top of that, it's of course the risk management. You don't want to harm any neighbor with an earthquake, so good monitoring standards and limits and traffic light systems need to be in place. Apart from that, a lot of R&D work can continue to take place with those projects in place and to minimize to optimize the risk of the opportunities for the future. Some of them, for example, in hydraulic stimulations, took place and did not really enable a new industry, but some others will do. And we had some really great lessons learned with those R&D projects. And obviously, the government plays a big role, as I mentioned. Anywhere in the world, there are different governments with different views on what their role is in the perspective. But on the financial part, there's definitely an important role for governments to play, especially in that early phase of development. In some countries, it is feed-in tariffs that they guarantee a certain price for electricity or heat on which the developer can get a good project finance in place. But there are also examples that governmental bodies act as shareholders and take the risk, but also the benefit and the opportunity. So that's, I think, also a nice development. And one of the positive sides of that is that they can share the knowledge from one project to the other. But maybe for a more mature industry, that's not necessary anymore. It's really for the initiation of projects. And what we have seen locally here is a kind of geology guarantee. As in oil and gas, exploration is super risky. You are never sure if you drill your first well in a region which is relatively unknown, if there is a good aquifer in place or not. And if the government can just take that risk, then the rest of the business case and the responsibilities can remain with the operator and the organization itself. And that's a kind of a gift from society to bring certain projects in place. And other things, especially in the beginning of projects, which can also work very well, is just grants or funds or subsidies on certain technology developments, because every project in a completely new area will face some challenges in the beginning. You really need to go over that first threshold to go into that upscaling effect. Some other roles the government can play is to manage the data in regions, to really collect all the data from the E&P operators and make them available for these kind of developments. Either by making maps of GIS, geographic information systems online, or by means of supporting conference developments and conferences where the knowledge is shared, etc., etc. The government can play many roles in de-risking by data, for example. And one other thing a government is very good at is to support that public relations and acceptance. If a government plays that role by playing the authority on risk, on challenges that will allow the public to accept certain developments in their area. And obviously there is law, and a mining law is often in place for oil and gas, but not always for geothermal. And that obviously doesn't need to be in place for your first pilot project, but then it's about tolerating some experiments, obviously in good communication. and a mining law needs to be developed. And to develop a law for a particular industry, you also need to see some examples in practice. And if that is all a bit more sorted, then obviously a permitting process needs to be smooth, and people with experience and knowledge need to execute those permitting processes. So I think government is a very, very important stakeholder, which should understand its role. Without a clear governmental perspective on the development of geothermal, it will be very difficult to execute geothermal projects or even developing an entire industry. This was more or less the last slide of my presentation. I just have a short sheet in here what we often do here in geothermal. But if that's of any interest to you, feel free to contact either myself or Jorge, who is the regional director in the region. Thanks a lot, Stefan.
Thank you, Tiffen. Thank you, sorry. It's good to thank oneself, but I wanted to thank you. A lot of questions are in Spanish, so maybe you can switch to the English translation to understand the question. The first one, ¿cómo se encuentra una zona adecuada para obtener energía geotérmica? Did you get that, or do you want me to translate?
Yes, I did get that. Thank you. Well, there are sometimes incentives, as I mentioned, which are very unique. For example, hot springs or volcanic areas, which are really known for higher temperatures. If that's the case, then you can do a regional study with various exploration techniques to see where there are faults. Fault means an open fracture in the subsurface, and it often starts shallow, and if that's a success, you can go look deeper and deeper. But there are also opportunities where the oil and gas industry has large amounts of data on permeability, on aquifers, sometimes even on temperatures, and that could be a good initiation of a development in that particular sedimentary region. If you go really from scratch, then you will need specialist geologists to map a certain area and to do some exploration work. Exploration work means drilling wells, doing seismic interpretations, which cost money. In that particular case, I think it's almost impossible for from a business perspective to develop a geothermal project there, but it could be a very good opportunity for a government to play that first role.
Okay. La misma persona tiene otra pregunta, pero es una pregunta específica de Uruguay. Entonces, bueno, la vamos a pasar, Elias. Digo, históricamente, bueno, las termas de Uruguay se encontraron por búsqueda de petróleo en los años 40, si no me equivoco. Vamos a seguir con pregunta de Mario, que es en inglés. How are you facing the challenges of high coefficient of friction at those high temperatures? ¿Cómo pueden enfrentar los desafíos de un coeficiente alto de fricción a temperaturas tan altas?
The friction in the well is as big as you make, as large you make your well. So, but if you look at friction, I would say my first answer would be drill a bigger well and get higher volumes through. If you compare oil and gas wells to geothermal wells, that's often a big difference. So the geothermal wells are often much larger in diameter to enable large volumes. And if you talk about friction, it's probably related to those kind of wells, but there are also remediations or problem solvers for friction, but that's more on the coating and GRE lining kind of technologies. So there are options there. But if you just say friction of production and injection wells, it's basically a matter of engineering. You can solve that.
Well, I will add something. It did kind of the same problem with HPHT oil and gas wells. Maybe.
Yes, correct. But it's a general engineering challenge, yeah. And okay. I think for each specific situation, there are ways to deal with that. But it's a very technical, detailed question, so I cannot really see the case behind it.
Yeah, but it depends on the characteristics of your reservoir and of the fluid you have inside.
Yeah, so basically if you have an open system, you first have to get it out of the reservoir. That's friction between either faults or permeable sandstones. Then you have friction in your well itself, and then you have to get it back in your injection well if you have a production and injection well. There are also examples where there is production only and no injection.
Ok, tenemos 5 minutos y otras preguntas. Geothermal is a great opportunity to produce green hydrogen, compress and liquefy hydrogen. Have you spotted or analyzed such a system?
Sorry, I missed the first part.
Yo, bueno, la voy a hacer en español. Geotermia es una oportunidad grande para producir hidrógeno verde, comprimir y licuar hidrógeno. Si la oportunidad ha sido detectada y analizada. Yo creo que hablaste algo de hidrógeno en tu presentación, justamente.
Yes, correct. That's what I mentioned, is that it is possible to generate electricity and then use the electricity to generate hydrogen. But normally for those steps, you can also produce electricity directly. So if there is an area where there is so much great geology to produce electricity from, then it could be interesting to really go large scale and develop hydrogen for export. But there are conversion steps which are not really favorable, so it does cost a lot of energy to create that hydrogen. That's why you really need to have that great geothermal play in one area to enable that large scale development. You don't make hydrogen production for just small amounts, and you don't export it for small amounts. So yes, it is being looked at also by larger companies, and it's very dependent on the specific geology, if it's and also the infrastructure around it, if it is achievable or not. Technically, yes, definitely. If it's commercially viable is the next question.
Okay, tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más y tenemos que cerrar. Quiero aclarar a los asistentes que las preguntas que quedan sin responder serán mandadas a Floris y recibirán la respuesta a su pregunta si está dentro de la competencia de Floris, obviamente. Entonces, una última pregunta: si existen pilotos en el medio marino, offshore, I guess.
There have been a lot of studies looking at it, and there is no example I know about which is currently in use. one of the potential geothermal projects offshore are to use the heat from certain aquifers already connected to a platform to use the heat for the oil viscosity. But that's about it. And I'm not sure if we should really call that geothermal. We looked into many other developments offshore as well. But if you look at the costs related to any activity offshore, it's really difficult. You should be on a kind of great spot where there's a very high temperature, and then you could consider making electricity from it. But normal geothermal operations are already difficult to get fully commercial. So this is really a next step, which I think we are not ready for yet.
Okay, there are a lot. Perdón. Tenemos más preguntas que la verdad que hay unas que son muy interesantes, pero desgraciadamente ya llegamos a la hora de esta actividad. Bueno, agradecer a Floris y a Sproule por proponer estas dos actividades sobre, bueno, la primera, como ya dije, sobre CCUS, captura y almacenamiento y uso de carbono, y ahora sobre geotermia y sobre esta industria que entiendo que ya existe, o ya se está desarrollando en Europa, pero que acá hay potencial, pero que todavía no existe como industria. Y bueno, eso, que les vamos a mandar a todos los que se anotaron la presentación de Floris, el enlace a la grabación de este webinar, y tanto Floris como Jorge están a disposición para responder a sus preguntas. Desde ARPEL, obviamente, si acá hay empresas no socias y que estén interesadas en trabajar con nosotros en transiciones energéticas o en otros temas que estamos trabajando junto con nuestras empresas socias, están también bienvenidos y me pueden contactar. Muchas gracias a todos y hasta un próximo webinar. Gracias, chao.